The next piece of data is appearances to skeptics. It is almost unanimously accepted that James and the brothers of Jesus were not his followers during his crucifixion. It is also unanimously accepted that Paul was an enemy of the church originally and a later convert. The reason for this is Paul admits it himself and cites an early creed in Galatians 1:22-23. He who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. If we add the account in Acts, we have multiple attestation, and it meets the criteria of embarrassment, since Paul reports it himself that he was once the enemy and was in the wrong. The same goes for the conversion of James. It is clear in the early material of Paul that the leader of the Jerusalem church was none other than James, the brother of Jesus. However, all the evidence suggested James did not believe his brother was the Christ during Jesus' ministry. The Gospels embarrassingly report that the brothers of Jesus were skeptical of him. No early Christian would dare attack a prominent leader in the church by claiming he was once Jesus' enemy. James was also not listed as one present at the cross, and Jesus surrendered his mother over to the beloved disciple. But why not his own brothers if they were in the Christian ranks? This is why most scholars accept James and his brothers were early skeptics and only converted after the crucifixion. So what happened that turned these enemies into believers? Well, the mythic theory has a hard time explaining this, since Paul was very early on writing and quoting a creed about his own conversion. Also, mentioning that James was an early skeptic would not have been made up, as no Christian would dare to dishonor, shame, or lie about one of their own leaders in such a terrible way. So this fact would not have been made up later on. Yet it is clear James was the early leader of the Jerusalem church, as Paul and Josephus record. Could James and Paul have lied? The question must be asked, why on earth would they have done that? The early church was a small, persecuted, and hated minority, with a Messiah who was just shamefully crucified as a criminal, and was too poor to even afford their own tomb. Jesus had dishonored the family, and James was already opposed to him. Why would James suddenly feel the need to make up an appearance of Jesus' resurrection if there was nothing to gain and only shame and dishonor to suddenly reverse and proclaim his brother was Lord, after he had already mocked him openly? To do such a thing would make no sense. Paul also had no reason to try this. He was at the top of his game, a prominent leader on the rise, and making a name for himself while he persecuted the church. He had everything going for him, and suddenly he has an urge to leave all that and join the persecuted minority he had already hated? Such a sudden conversion, he knew to be a lie, would take a miracle in itself if nothing else. So what if they both hallucinated? Well, adding more hallucinations to this theory begins to multiply its assumptions and causes it to lack parsimony. It is even harder to explain since neither of them were grieving that Jesus had died, especially Paul, who hated the church. James may have been in grief for his brother, but he didn't believe he was the Lord, and would never have expected or even considered a physical resurrection, since a dying and rising Messiah was not part of Second Temple Judaism beliefs. As scholar Mike Lacona says, James and his brothers would have regarded their dead brother as a heretic rather than rush to Jerusalem and be caught up in the group ecstasy. It seems more likely that Jesus' execution as a criminal and a blasphemer would have supported their continual unbelief rather than their conversion. The plausibility of Paul having hallucination is even far lower than James, since hallucinations usually happen for people who are expecting them and grieving over the death of a loved one. Neither of these would have been the case for Paul, nor would a mere vision have caused his sudden conversion. As we said earlier, the early church knew what visions were, and if Paul simply had a dream, he would have called it a dream and moved on. A hallucination would be very improbable as the cause of Paul's sudden conversion. However, the Christian theory can easily explain the conversion and appearance to skeptics. If Jesus really did rise and appear to them, that would be enough to cause their miraculous conversion. This brings us to the appearances themselves. As for Paul, who was a skeptic, he accepts Paul had to experience something which would cause his conversion, but he just says Paul had a vision which converted him. But as we have already demonstrated, this is untenable, since Paul would have been the least likely to convert or experience a hallucination of Jesus. So this is ad hoc. Another issue is Ludemann is trying to psychoanalyze Paul. This is even hard to do by psychologists who have a subject in front of them. As Martin Hengel says, Ludemann does not recognize these limits on the historian. Here he gets into the realm of psychological explanations, for which no verification is really possible. Moreover, the sources are far too limited for such psychologizing analyses. There just isn't enough information to know if Paul was troubled by guilt before his conversion. All we have are letters from after his conversion, and there is no indication he was suffering from guilt and sin and projecting negative emotions onto Christians. On the contrary, we have more evidence Paul and Pharisees like him did not experience such struggles in standing against Christians. Swedish scholar Christer Stendahl says, "Contrast Paul, a very happy and successful Jew, one who can, even when he thinks about it from his Christian perspective, say in his epistle to the Philippians, 'As to the righteousness under the law, I was blameless.' That is what he says. He experiences no troubles, no problems, no qualms of conscience, no feelings of shortcomings. He is a star pupil, the student to get the $1,000 graduate scholarship in Gamaliel's seminary. Nowhere in Paul's writings is there any indication that he had any difficulties in fulfilling what he, as a Jew, understood to be the requirements of the law." And Gary Habermas and Mike Licona point out from what we know about Paul, he does not fit the profile of one who is likely to experience a conversion psychosis, as according to Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So there is no reason Paul would be a likely candidate to suffer some type of internal delusion. No evidence is given anywhere that he was in a troubled condition, and he doesn't fit the profile. And even if by some chance that he did, there is no reason it would cause a sudden conversion. This view about Paul is entirely ad hoc, implausible, lacks explanatory power, and is simply made out of thin air. The same can be said about James. As we said in the second video of this series, there is no reason the shameful execution and death of Jesus would suddenly convince his skeptical brother to proclaim him as Lord, let alone get caught up in some group ecstasy of just 500. It is more likely the death of Jesus would only continue his unbelief.